From the moment Karen marched up my driveway and declared, with absolute confidence, that she owned half my property, I knew my quiet life was about to explode into chaos. It wasn't the claim itself that shocked me, it was the certainty in her voice, the rehearsed indignation, the way she spoke as if the ground beneath my feet had already been signed over to her. She pointed toward my yard, toward the fence my grandfather built, and said the words that would ignite everything: "You've been living on my land for years and I'm done being generous." Neighbors peeked through curtains. A truck idled at the curb. Karen held a printed map she found online, highlighted with crooked yellow marker, insisting it was official proof. I tried to stay calm, but her tone wasn't just entitled, it was threatening. She said she would force a formal land survey, drag the county into it, and make sure I paid every cent for trespassing on what she believed was hers. The truth was, my family had owned this property for decades. We had original deeds, notarized plats, archived drawings, history that stretched back before Karen even moved into the neighborhood. But she didn't want facts, she wanted control. She smirked like the decision was already made, like the survey would expose my secret wrongdoing and elevate her as the righteous victor. And yet, beneath all that arrogance, I saw something else: desperation. She needed this to be true. I agreed to the survey, not because I believed her, but because I wanted everything exposed in the open where evidence couldn't be twisted. I told her, calmly, that if she was so confident, then she should be ready to accept whatever truth the survey revealed, even if it wasn't the one she expected. Karen smiled like a predator who thought she'd already won. She had no idea that forcing that survey would become the biggest mistake of her life, and that the truth buried beneath the soil would shatter everything she believed she controlled. And from that moment forward, the lines on the ground were no longer just boundaries. They were a battlefield. By the time the county scheduled the survey, Karen had turned the neighborhood into a stage. She walked door to door telling everyone that soon half my yard would belong to her, and that the rest of us would learn how property laws really work. I kept quiet, but inside, the pressure tightened like a knot. I spent evenings going through boxes in the attic, searching for every scrap of documentation my family ever saved. Old survey pins wrapped in cloth, brittle deeds, folded diagrams drawn in the careful ink of another era. Each piece felt like a voice from the past telling me to stand firm. But Karen didn't slow down. She filmed videos on her porch, waving her printed map like a badge, claiming I was squatting on land that rightfully belonged to her. Some neighbors believed her. Others avoided eye contact, waiting for the drama to unfold like a storm creeping across the horizon. The morning the surveyors arrived, the street grew silent. Their truck rolled to a stop and two men stepped out, calm, professional, and uninterested in gossip. Karen rushed forward, already explaining her version of the truth, but they simply nodded and asked for access points, corners, and original boundary markers. I guided them through the yard while Karen followed close behind, whispering that the results would expose my years of deception. I felt the weight of history hovering over every step. Each orange flag they planted was like a heartbeat echoing through time, measuring not just distance but consequences. When the lead surveyor asked for archival deeds, I handed him the envelope my grandfather once sealed. He studied it carefully, eyebrows tightening with interest rather than doubt. Karen's smile flickered for the first time, like a light struggling to stay on while the room around it slowly darkened. I realized then that this was bigger than a boundary dispute. It was a story about pride, memory, and the danger of building certainty on shaky ground. The truth was no longer approaching, it was already taking shape beneath our feet, and soon, it would choose a side. Karen folded her arms and pretended to look confident, yet every new measurement seemed to pull the ground a little farther from under her. I stayed quiet, letting the evidence speak. The yard felt different now, not smaller, not larger, just honest, and honesty was slowly becoming unavoidable. The surveyors continued their work in silence while the neighborhood watched from shaded porches. What none of them knew was that the final markers would reveal more than property lines. They would uncover the past Karen tried to rewrite and prove that the truth had always been waiting beneath our quiet street forever. The next day, the surveyors returned to verify every corner, and by then the entire neighborhood seemed to orbit our yard like moths circling a porch light. Karen stood near her patio with folded arms, pretending control, yet her eyes followed every measurement as if each inch threatened her certainty. The lead surveyor compared notes with the archival plat, tracing invisible lines in the air while his assistant uncovered an old brass pin buried beneath the roots of a hedge my grandfather planted. When the pin surfaced, polished by soil and time, the surveyor paused, then quietly adjusted his map. Karen tried to laugh it off, insisting the marker was outdated, but the surveyor explained that original monuments spoke louder than modern redrawings. His tone was patient, professional, impossible to argue with. He measured again, checked satellite coordinates, then walked straight across Karen's patio stones and placed a bright orange flag in the middle of them. Conversations on nearby porches stopped mid-sentence. Karen's face drained of color. According to the documents, the patio, the pride of her backyard renovations, wasn't built on her property at all. It crossed the line by several feet, pressing directly into the boundary my family had protected for generations. The more the surveyor confirmed, the more truth peeled away the story Karen had rehearsed for weeks. She demanded a recheck, her voice rising like a kettle left on a hot stove, but the numbers stayed steady, unshaken by volume or emotion. The surveyor read from the deed, pointed to the brass pin, then to the weathered fence post my grandfather installed, explaining how each landmark aligned with the legal description. Evidence formed a chain she couldn't break. For the first time, Karen fell silent. Pride fought reality across her expression, and the silence around us grew heavier than her accusations ever had. I didn't celebrate. I simply stood there, remembering the nights I'd wondered whether truth still mattered in a world that moved too fast for patience. Now it stood in front of us, measured, documented, undeniable. The survey team concluded their work as the sun dipped behind the houses, casting long shadows that seemed to trace the rightful border across the grass. Karen remained by her patio, staring at the flag planted where her certainty used to live, and I understood that this was only the beginning of the consequences waiting ahead. Neighbors lingered quietly at the curb, no longer whispering predictions, but witnessing a truth too solid to dismiss, and as the cool evening breeze crossed the yard, I realized the line she tried to claim had always been more than property. It was the boundary between entitlement and accountability. Its lesson would follow every step she took afterward. The next morning, word of the survey spread like wildfire. Karen's phone was blowing up with calls from neighbors, the HOA, even distant relatives, all curious about what had been uncovered. I stayed inside, sifting through my grandfather's old journals and property maps, the yellowed pages feeling like a lifeline to the past. Each diagram, each note, reminded me that every inch of this land had a story, and the survey had only confirmed what decades of care had protected. Karen stormed onto my porch, waving her tablet like a weapon. "You're hiding something," she accused, her voice sharp and trembling. But I didn't respond. Her fury, while loud, was powerless against decades of documented truth. She demanded I explain the survey results, as if words alone could erase the boundaries the survey had confirmed. I remained calm, letting the evidence speak louder than her shouting. The HOA got involved the next day. A board member, clipboard in hand, arrived to mediate. Karen insisted I owed her compensation for years of unauthorized use, citing her online map and countless videos she'd filmed in preparation for this showdown. But the HOA's representative reviewed the survey and original deeds. His eyes widened slightly as he traced the line from the brass pin to the old fence post, then back to Karen's encroaching patio. "According to this survey," he said carefully, "the property line is exactly where it's marked here. Everything beyond this point is yours." Karen sputtered, trying to interject, but the representative continued without pause, confirming that any claim she made was invalid. Even the neighbors watching from across the street whispered in disbelief. As Karen's protests fell flat, the reality sank in. The survey had exposed the full extent of her misunderstanding, or perhaps her deliberate misrepresentation. The patio she loved, the garden she bragged about, the corner of land she thought was hers, all legally mine. Evidence had cut through entitlement like a knife, and no amount of yelling or video evidence could rewrite history. I walked past the markers, letting my fingers graze the flag stakes and fence posts. The yard felt alive, like it was finally breathing again after weeks of tension. Karen lingered behind, her anger fading into stunned silence. For the first time, I saw not just frustration in her eyes, but a recognition. She had underestimated the power of preparation, documentation, and the quiet persistence of truth. The property line wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a testament. A warning. A revelation. And for Karen, it had become a lesson she would never forget. After the HOA confirmed the survey, Karen's posture shifted. The confidence that had driven her through weeks of accusations now cracked, replaced by frustration, disbelief, and embarrassment. She tried arguing that the survey was flawed or incomplete, but even her most loyal online supporters, who had watched her videos of bravado, began questioning her claims. The truth was undeniable, and evidence has a way of turning spectators into skeptics. I spent the morning walking the yard, examining the markers, the brass pin, the orange flags, and thinking about the years my family had maintained the property. Every hedge, every tree, every fence post held memory, history, and intention. Karen's aggressive push for half the land had unintentionally reminded me how important it was to preserve these stories. The land wasn't just soil and grass, it was a living archive, a testament to generations of care and attention. Karen, meanwhile, had begun documenting the survey herself, snapping photos of the stakes and plotting them on her tablet. But she wasn't recording evidence, she was desperately searching for a loophole, a tiny discrepancy that might give her a foothold. Her frustration was palpable, her voice sharp with irritation, yet every glance at the map confirmed the unavoidable: she had no claim. The neighbors, who had once whispered behind curtains, now approached me cautiously, asking about the process, the survey, and how the property had been legally documented. Their curiosity felt intrusive at first, but I realized it wasn't about me, it was about witnessing truth and justice unfold in a way that wasn't common in suburban life. Karen had made her move publicly, and the resolution was public as well. By mid-afternoon, the survey team returned to finalize the report. I handed them every document, every deed, every photo, confident that the evidence left no room for ambiguity. Karen hovered at the edge of the yard, muttering complaints, but the team worked efficiently and silently. Each measurement they recorded reinforced what had become a quiet but undeniable reality: the land she claimed was legally mine, from the fence post to the old oak tree at the corner. When the final report was printed, Karen's face betrayed a mixture of shock and defeat. She looked at the legal description, compared it to her maps, and realized she had miscalculated, misrepresented, and misjudged. The survey had not just drawn lines in the dirt, it had exposed every assumption she had made about entitlement, control, and certainty. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden shadows across the yard, I felt a strange sense of calm. The battle wasn't over, there would be calls, emails, and maybe further disputes, but the truth was settled. And Karen's biggest mistake had been forcing it into the open, leaving no room for denial. The next morning, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Karen moved with careful calculation, as though every step might undo the survey's verdict, yet nothing she did could alter the truth. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee, and noticed how differently neighbors now treated her. Some avoided her entirely, others gave polite, distant nods. It was as if the survey had not only redrawn property lines, but also the social map of the street. Karen, undeterred, began contacting lawyers, claiming her survey was flawed and threatening to escalate the dispute. I calmly gathered all original documents, photographs of the brass pin, and copies of the surveyor's field notes. Each piece of evidence felt like armor, ready to defend what had always been mine. She may have had energy, audacity, and loud accusations, but she did not have history or fact on her side. By late morning, the Hoa sent a mediator to review the dispute formally. Karen showed up, tablet in hand, trying to argue about modern maps and her video proof, while I presented the decades-old deeds, historical surveys, and corner markers carefully preserved. The mediator, a calm, analytical professional, traced each line, measured each corner, and compared the survey's findings with legal documentation. Karen's confidence began to erode. The moment of truth arrived when the mediator placed the final survey map on the table. Every inch of her claimed property fell outside her boundaries. Even the patio she adored and the garden she cultivated encroached on land that legally belonged to me. Karen's shoulders slumped, her mouth opening to speak but closing again as reality pressed in. Neighbors watching through windows and across fences sensed the finality of the moment. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles when entitlement meets evidence and loses. I remained calm, knowing that this was not about humiliation, but about justice and truth finally prevailing. Karen attempted one last argument, asking whether she could appeal or recheck the survey, but the mediator explained the legal weight of the findings. Every claim she made dissolved under scrutiny, and her threats to escalate further fell flat. The property line had been established, measured, and documented beyond dispute. By the afternoon, the report was finalized. Karen left the neighborhood, retreating with quiet defeat rather than loud outrage. I walked along the markers, touching the brass pin and orange stakes, feeling the weight of history beneath my fingers. The property line was no longer a mere line in the dirt, it was a testament to preparation, patience, and the power of truth. The following days were quiet but tense. Karen's absence from the neighborhood didn't erase the echoes of her claims. Conversations that once centered on trivial gossip now included subtle references to the survey, the brass pins, and the orange stakes marking the rightful boundaries. Even casual neighbors who had never interacted with me directly began nodding, offering congratulations, or sharing stories of similar disputes they'd quietly endured. It was a strange mix of relief and vindication, but it reinforced that the truth had a ripple effect far beyond the fence line. Despite the calm, Karen wasn't finished. She sent letters to the Hoa, demanding reconsideration, and posted videos online trying to expose the so-called errors in the survey. I didn't respond. Instead, I organized my documentation, photographing every deed, survey map, and historical record. I even reached out to the surveyor to ensure he could confirm the findings if her threats escalated. Each step I took was deliberate, building an unshakable wall of evidence, prepared for any further confrontation. Neighbors began approaching me with curiosity and questions, wanting to understand how the dispute had been resolved. I explained the process, how the original deeds, the brass pins, and meticulous surveys revealed the truth. Many were astonished that Karen had miscalculated so dramatically, believing her confident assertion that half my land belonged to her. The contrast between her bluster and the evidence had become a cautionary tale, a lesson in arrogance and overconfidence. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration boiled over in small ways. One afternoon, she appeared at the edge of her property, glaring at the stakes marking the legal boundary. I walked over calmly, nodding politely, letting her simmer in her own realization that she had misjudged the law, the documents, and the facts. Her gestures were sharp, frustrated, even panicked, but there was no recourse left. The survey had spoken, and it had spoken decisively. By evening, I walked the property line, letting the fading sunlight cast long shadows along the orange flags. Each stake, each pin, each marker felt like a testament to persistence, preparation, and justice. The yard, once tense with uncertainty, now felt alive with clarity. The property wasn't just land anymore, it was a statement. Karen had forced the confrontation, and the truth had emerged stronger than her ambition. I realized then that the stakes weren't merely physical, they represented integrity, history, and the consequences of entitlement. Karen had made her biggest mistake, and in doing so, she inadvertently taught everyone watching that preparation, patience, and documented truth would always outlast arrogance and assumptions. Karen's frustration didn't vanish overnight. She tried quietly, behind closed doors, to rally support for her claim, contacting lawyers, neighbors, and even friends from her online circles. Her messages were increasingly desperate, arguing that the survey had somehow overlooked errors and that the stakes marked on my yard were unfair or inaccurate. But her momentum had evaporated. The evidence, the deeds, the brass pins, the verified survey maps was immovable, undeniable, and legally binding. I spent the week organizing everything, preparing for any potential challenge she might try to bring to court. Each document, each photo, each historical survey point was catalogued meticulously. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that no matter how loud Karen became, her assertions were hollow against decades of record keeping. The property line had been established beyond dispute, and it was protected by both history and law. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had begun to subtly shift. Conversations at fences, during walks, or at mailboxes referenced the incident. Karen had once commanded attention, but now her claims were quietly dismissed. People nodded to me with respect, not fear. They shared that they had watched the situation closely, astonished at how a confident assertion, built on assumption and arrogance, had crumbled under the weight of evidence. One morning, Karen appeared at her front yard, her hands clutched tightly around her tablet, scanning the orange survey flags as if she could will them into a different location. I walked past her, nodding politely, saying nothing. She looked up, eyes wide, but her voice faltered. She realized that no argument, no amount of social proof, could undo the line the survey had drawn. The truth had become a permanent fixture on the land. Later that afternoon, the HOA confirmed in writing that the property line was accurate, that all claims she had made were invalid, and that any further complaints would not be entertained. Karen's options had dwindled to near nothing. Her attempt to claim half my property, a move made with arrogance and certainty, had not only failed, but exposed her to scrutiny from neighbors and authorities alike. Walking along the fence, I touched the brass pin and orange stakes. It wasn't just metal and wood anymore, it was history, justice, and the physical manifestation of preparation meeting truth. Karen's biggest mistake had been forcing the survey, underestimating both the legal weight of my family's records and the consequences of her own assumptions. The land, once contested, now stood as a silent monument to fact prevailing over bluster, and I finally felt the calm that had been missing for weeks. The final week brought a quiet resolution. Karen, realizing there was no path left, withdrew from the neighborhood's spotlight. Her videos stopped, her messages went unanswered, and the bravado that had once defined her presence was replaced with silence. The survey, once a source of tension and conflict, had become the ultimate authority, and the stakes and pins I had walked past daily stood as proof that the land's history could not be rewritten. I walked along the property line one last time, feeling the cool metal of the brass pin beneath my fingers. Each orange flag marked more than a boundary, it marked endurance, truth, and the foresight of generations who had meticulously documented and cared for this land. I reflected on the weeks of confrontation, the tension, and the fear that Karen's claims could somehow succeed. But all along, preparation and patience had turned what could have been a nightmare into a story of justice prevailing. Neighbors began approaching with congratulations, sharing their relief that the dispute was over. Many admitted they had feared the chaos Karen promised, but now they saw the importance of documentation, diligence, and standing firm when confronted with baseless claims. The survey had not only resolved a property line dispute, it had reminded everyone that entitlement has limits, and evidence has weight. Karen's biggest mistake was clear: she underestimated history, underprepared herself, and assumed that boldness could outweigh truth. The survey exposed her miscalculations and left her credibility in ruins. It was a hard lesson in arrogance, entitlement, and the consequences of trying to rewrite reality for personal gain. The patio she loved, the garden she proudly tended, and the corner she assumed was hers were all legally mine. Every claim she made had been dismantled, every assertion corrected, and every assumption disproven. By evening, the neighborhood felt calm again. Children played near the fence, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the tension that had lingered like a cloud finally dissipated. I stood at the edge of my property, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the orange flags glowing softly in the fading light. What had started as a confrontation with Karen had become a demonstration of what happens when arrogance meets fact, and the truth refuses to be bent. As I walked back to the house, I realized that this story wasn't just about property. It was about preparation, patience, and standing firm when others try to impose their will. Karen's mistake had been forcing the survey, and in doing so, she revealed more than a property line. She revealed that truth, history, and evidence always endure, long after pride and entitlement fade. The yard was quiet, the stakes still in place, and I finally felt the peace that comes when justice is done.